You feel in control, but physics has no respect for your experience. Today we break down 6 cases where fatal overconfidence became the final word. This isn't entertainment, it's a cold dissection of errors that cost lives. Watch, learn, and remember. The laws of nature have no exceptions. 1 February 14th, 1974, upstate New York. The air is bitterly cold and completely still. A massive winter blizzard has finally passed, leaving the rural farming valley buried under 3 feet of solid white powder. The world is deceptively quiet and entirely frozen. In the center of this isolated landscape stands a massive, aging wooden barn. It is a towering structure built decades ago from thick cedar and heavy oak. The vast, pitched roof is currently holding an unnatural and deeply dangerous burden. Over 30 inches of incredibly dense, moisture-laden snow presses down heavily on the aging shingles. This is not light, fluffy winter snow. It is wet, compacted spring snow, acting exactly like a layer of heavy, wet concrete. Up on this precarious, slippery slope stands 62-year-old Carl Snyder. He is a man carved from generations of stubborn, independent pride. Carl is methodically scraping away the heavy powder with a wide aluminum shovel. His muscles burn from the intense physical labor. He completely ignores the biting wind numbing his bare hands. Most dangerously, he deliberately ignores the deep, agonizing groans echoing from the stressed wooden rafters directly beneath his boots. This massive barn is his ultimate personal legacy. He felled the trees and built it with his own 2 hands exactly 30 years ago. In his rigid mind, it remains an indestructible fortress, but human ego cannot stop the silent, microscopic fungal rot that has been weakening the internal roof beams for over a decade. Down on the plowed driveway below, his neighbor Thomas is frantically waving his arms. Thomas is a younger structural contractor, and he can clearly see the fatal geometry that Carl refuses to acknowledge. From the ground level, the entire roof line is visibly sagging in the center. The normally straight architectural lines are dangerously bowed under the crushing tension. Thomas cups his hands and shouts urgently through the cold air. He warns Carl that the internal support beams are visibly failing. He begs the older man to climb down immediately so they can install temporary steel support pillars. Carl simply stops shoveling. He glares down aggressively at the younger neighbor. His immense pride is deeply offended by the unsolicited advice. He leans over the icy edge of the roof and shouts back with absolute misplaced confidence. "I built this massive thing entirely myself. It will hold an atomic bomb, so do not try to teach me." Carl turns his broad back dismissively to the desperate warning. He grips his heavy shovel tightly. To prove a point, he violently drives the sharp steel edge of his tool deep into a highly compacted mound of solid ice. This arrogant, impulsive action seals his fate. The structural reality of the barn was already pushed to its absolute maximum limit. The heavy roof was holding well over 6 tons of static dead weight. The rotting central oak beam was barely holding together. The violent downward kinetic strike of Carl's shovel acts as a sudden, concentrated shockwave. It sends a sharp vibration straight through the frozen roof and directly into the failing timber below. It is the final drop of kinetic energy the compromised wood can absorb. A deafening, incredibly violent crack suddenly rings out across the silent valley. It sounds exactly like a large tree splitting in half. The primary central wooden beam snaps completely under the immense downward pressure. Carl freezes in pure terror, the aluminum shovel hovering uselessly in his hands. Gravity immediately takes complete control. The geometric stability of the massive roof instantly evaporates. The center of the roof folds aggressively inward, creating a massive, inescapable crater right beneath Carl's heavy boots. The solid world completely drops away from him in a terrifying freefall. The descent is blindingly fast and utterly chaotic. Carl plunges 22 feet vertically straight down into the cavernous, freezing interior of the barn. He is immediately followed by 6 tons of compacted snow, thousands of shattered wooden shingles, and massive, splintered oak beams. The human biological system simply cannot withstand the sudden impact force of collapsing heavy timber. Carl impacts the freezing dirt floor with tremendous downward velocity. A massive section of the broken central beam violently strikes his upper torso from above. The kinetic energy transfer causes catastrophic, non-survivable blunt force trauma to his entire upper torso structure. The immense, unyielding weight of the localized debris immediately compromises his internal structure. Fatal injury is absolutely instantaneous upon the final impact. The heavy compression totally prevents any lung expansion. Rapid loss of consciousness and total cardiac arrest follow within seconds in the crushing darkness. The residual scene is chillingly still. A massive cloud of fine white snow and pulverized wood dust billows outward from the shattered doorway. Slowly, the thick dust settles heavily over the ruined structure. Complete silence reclaims the frozen valley. The terrified neighbor stands paralyzed on the driveway, staring blankly at a massive grave of splintered wood. Deep inside the destroyed barn, the shiny aluminum snow shovel rests perfectly intact on top of the deadly pile of rubble. It catches a stray beam of winter sunlight, completely indifferent to the tragic lesson in structural engineering. 2 August 12, 1997, the Pacific Northwest. A heavy-duty latex bungee cord hangs perfectly motionless above a deep river gorge. It is meticulously engineered to safely absorb the kinetic energy of a falling human body. High above this tested safety equipment, the afternoon sun beats down mercilessly on a massive steel suspension bridge. Exactly 300 feet below the metal railing, a deep, rushing river carves its way through a jagged granite canyon. The dizzying sound of roaring white water echoes loudly against the steep rock walls. On the designated jumping platform, the sharp metallic clicking of heavy steel carabiners fills the tense air. This is a popular, highly regulated commercial bungee jumping operation. The system relies entirely on strict mathematical physics and absolute weight limits. The heavy latex rubber bungee cords are meticulously engineered to safely absorb the kinetic energy of a falling human body. The absolute maximum weight limit, printed in bright red letters on the warning sign, is 220 pounds. Standing aggressively at the front of the line is Paul Brody. He is a towering, heavily built man weighing exactly 300 pounds. He considers himself an invincible extreme sports expert. Today, his only goal is to conquer this highly publicized bridge jump. He is fueled by adrenaline and staggering arrogance. The young, intimidated jump operators actively block his path to the edge. They calmly try to explain the basic physics of the safety harnesses. They tell him he is simply too heavy for the ankle strap stitching. Paul immediately erupts into a furious, highly public meltdown. His face flushes bright red as he violently shoves past the safety barricade. He aggressively grabs the thick primary bungee cord and begins loudly belittling the terrified teenagers running the platform. "I am an actual structural engineer," he screams, towering over a young employee. "This massive industrial cable could literally hold a full-grown elephant. Do not ever try to teach me about physics." Blinded by an obsessive need for control, Paul uses his sheer physical size to bully his way to the edge. He unilaterally bypasses the mandatory double-check safety procedure. He rapidly clips the heavy steel locking carabiner directly onto the nylon straps of his personal ankle harness. He fundamentally misunderstands how bungee jumping actually works. The thick rubber cord does not just hold your normal static weight. When a heavy human body falls from a great height, gravity multiplies its force. When you finally hit the bottom of the drop, that sudden violent deceleration pulls on your body with thousands of pounds of kinetic force. The thick rubber cord can easily survive this extreme tension. The wearable nylon ankle straps physically stitched around a person's legs cannot. Paul fails to respect this terrifying mathematical reality. He steps forcefully onto the grated metal launch pad. The lead operator shouts one final desperate warning. Paul merely smirks, completely convinced of his own intellectual superiority. He aggressively pushes off the solid steel platform and dives headfirst into the vast canyon. Gravity immediately seizes complete control of his massive frame. The wind roars deafeningly in his ears as the steel bridge rapidly shrinks away above him. The heavy green river rushes upward at a terrifying velocity. For a brief, agonizing 3 seconds, the jump actually feels perfectly normal. The thick latex bungee cord rapidly uncoils behind him. It begins to dramatically stretch and tense in the air. He spreads his arms out wide, eagerly anticipating the thrilling upward rebound. He finally reaches the extreme bottom of the parabolic arc. This is the exact microsecond where the maximum amount of violent kinetic energy transfers from his falling body directly into the safety equipment. The heavy-duty rubber bungee cord actually performs perfectly without snapping. However, the wearable nylon ankle straps are subjected to the catastrophic shock load of a 300-pound man falling at maximum speed. The immense opposing forces rip violently through the heavy-duty nylon safety stitching, exactly like tearing through wet paper. The mechanical separation is absolutely instantaneous. Two sharp, deafening pops echo loudly across the granite gorge as the ankle harness completely disintegrates. Paul is instantly separated from the only lifeline keeping him alive. The immense upward tension of the bungee cord is suddenly released. The human body continues its terrifying, unhindered downward trajectory. He plummets the remaining 40 feet directly into the shallow, rocky water below. The final impact is heavily catastrophic and entirely non-survivable. The massive kinetic transfer upon striking the solid granite riverbed causes immediate structural failure of his entire skeletal system. Severe blunt force trauma instantly compromises his central nervous system. Total loss of consciousness and subsequent irreversible cardiac arrest occur in a fraction of a second. The biological machine is instantly deactivated by the raw blunt force of the indifferent planet. High above the gorge, the massive bungee cord violently snaps back upward toward the steel bridge, with a terrifying whip-like crack. It launches high into the summer sky, completely empty. The jump operators stand utterly paralyzed in deathly silence on the metal platform. They stare down into the canyon in profound horror. Only the two torn, frayed pieces of black nylon from the destroyed ankle straps remain dangling from the heavy steel carabiner. They swing gently back and forth in the warm breeze. The arrogant shouts of the self-proclaimed engineer have been entirely silenced by the immutable laws of gravity. 3 October 5, 2003, Katmai National Park, Alaska. 46-year-old Timothy Treadwell sits inside a fragile nylon tent, entirely convinced he shares a supernatural bond with wild apex predators. He is an enthusiastic wildlife filmmaker, camped in an isolated, completely unprotected area. Outside his thin walls, the late autumn air is brutally cold and heavy with freezing rain. The sharp smell of damp pine needles, decaying salmon, and wet earth dominates the atmosphere. He has spent 13 consecutive summers living entirely unescorted among wild grizzly bears. Timothy is utterly convinced that he possesses a profound, supernatural ability to communicate with these massive predators. Standard safety rules for navigating bear country are incredibly strict for a reason. Federal regulations require maintaining a distance of at least 100 yards from wild bears. You must secure all human food in heavy steel, bear-proof containers. You are highly advised to carry high-powered chemical deterrents, like concentrated pepper spray, at all times. Park rangers have repeatedly cited and fined Timothy for blatantly breaking these essential rules. They constantly begged him to carry basic defensive equipment to protect his own life. Timothy aggressively mocked these established safety protocols on camera. He publicly labeled them as tools for terrified, cowardly amateurs. He arrogantly insisted that his unique spiritual connection functioned as an impenetrable shield. He fundamentally forgot that nature does not negotiate with human emotions. Wild animals simply do not understand or respect human affection. The threat approaching his camp is driven entirely by desperate biological necessity. It is very late in the season. The local bears are entering a critical physiological state called hyperphagia. This is a relentless, biologically mandated feeding frenzy. The animal must constantly consume up to 20,000 calories a day to survive the upcoming winter hibernation. The incoming threat is an older, unfamiliar male bear, severely struggling to find adequate food. A fully grown adult grizzly is a terrifyingly efficient biological machine. It weighs over 1,000 pounds and possesses a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch. It relies entirely on cold evolutionary instinct. When this massive, starving predator silently steps out of the thick brush, Timothy steps outside his tent. He intends to confront it directly. He relies entirely on his usual tactic of gentle, high-pitched verbal scolding to assert dominance. He attempts to treat the massive apex predator exactly like a disobedient domestic dog, loudly declaring that he is one of them. the massive bear completely ignores the human commands. It drops its heavy head and charges forward with terrifying, explosive speed. A grizzly bear can accelerate to 35 miles per hour in seconds. Timothy realizes his fatal mistake, but it is far too late. The resulting physical interaction is incredibly brief and entirely catastrophic. The bear strikes with immense, predatory kinetic force. The sheer physical mass of the animal immediately knocks the human to the muddy ground. The subsequent impact involves severe blunt force trauma. Localized structural compromise of the human anatomy happens instantly. The massive mechanical pressure rapidly compromises critical internal biological systems. The fragile human body sustains non-survivable physical damage within moments. Rapid and severe vascular failure quickly deprives the central nervous system of necessary oxygen. Total loss of consciousness is followed rapidly by irreversible cardiac arrest. The strict biological reality of the food chain completely overrides the human illusion of total control. The scene the next morning is entirely devoid of human ego. A local bush pilot arrives to pick Timothy up, only to find the campsite completely abandoned. The fragile nylon tent lies completely crushed and structurally destroyed in the deep mud. Next to the collapsed structure, Timothy's digital video camera remains powered on. The plastic lens cap is still firmly attached, blocking any video. However, the internal microphone continued to record the chaotic, terrifying audio of the entire encounter onto a small tape. The tiny red recording light blinked steadily in the gloom, blindly documenting the exact moment a human being was reminded of a cold truth. The natural world operates entirely on the objective mechanics of survival, completely indifferent to arrogance. 4. November 12, 1982, a desolate commercial development site near the Scottish Highlands. A massive 40-ton hydraulic excavator sits idling at the very edge of a solid gravel road. Its huge yellow steel arm rests heavily on the cold, hard ground. The early morning air around the machine is bitter and thick with dense freezing fog. The heavy industrial smell of burning diesel fuel mixes sharply with the distinct odor of decaying organic plant matter. At the edge of a solid gravel road sits a massive, heavy-duty hydraulic excavator. Its huge yellow steel arm rests heavily on the cold, hard ground. The operator inside the climate-controlled cabin is a seasoned construction contractor named Richard Griffiths. He is a profoundly stubborn, calloused man whose entire professional identity is built upon relentless physical labor. He is currently tasked with moving this 40-ton piece of machinery across a wide stretch of undeveloped marshland. Standard engineering protocol for navigating heavy machinery across unknown terrain is extremely strict. It requires a comprehensive geological survey and core sampling. Workers must lay down heavy steel distribution mats to spread the extreme weight of the machinery safely. A team of trained land surveyors stands near the muddy bank, waving their clipboards. They urgently shout for Richard to stop the machine immediately. They have mapped the area with ground-penetrating radar and know the highly dangerous truth. The hidden danger here is the incredibly deceptive physical nature of a peat bog. A peat bog is not a solid field of dirt. It is actually a very deep, ancient underground lake. It is completely filled with thousands of gallons of liquid mud and decaying vegetation. The entire liquid mass is covered by a thin, fragile surface crust of woven moss and roots. Richard aggressively rolls down the heavy glass window of his cabin. He glares down at the educated surveyors with pure contempt. His immense pride easily overrides their concrete scientific data. "I have been driving heavy tractors for 30 consecutive years," he shouts loudly over the deafening roar of the large diesel engine. "I can feel the solid ground under the tracks, so do not try to tell me how to do my job." He rolls the window back up quickly, sealing himself tightly inside the soundproof steel box. He violently thrusts the control levers forward. The immense machine lurches off the safe, solid gravel road. It rolls directly onto the deceptive green surface of the ancient bog. The machine's incredibly heavy steel tracks distribute the massive 40-ton weight over a relatively small surface area. This generates massive localized downward pressure on the fragile root system. For about 30 seconds, the thick, interwoven roots of the surface crust actually hold the weight. The ground bows deeply like a giant green trampoline under the heavy steel tracks. Richard grins broadly, completely convinced of his own superior judgment and experience. This fleeting moment of success is an absolute, fatal illusion. The physical tension limits of the organic crust are rapidly exceeded. A loud, sickening, tearing sound echoes across the fog-covered marsh. The thick layer of moss completely shears open beneath the left steel track. The structural integrity of the ground instantly vanishes. It is immediately replaced by zero friction and pure liquid mud. The massive machine violently tilts sideways at a sharp 45-degree angle. Richard is thrown hard against the side glass. His confident grin is instantly replaced by sheer, blinding panic. He violently pulls the hydraulic levers backward, desperately trying to swing the heavy boom arm around to catch the solid gravel road. It is far too late for any mechanical course correction. Gravity violently pulls the massive, unbalanced steel block straight downward. The heavy excavator plunges rapidly into the freezing black mud. The cold, thick slurry rushes instantly over the hot engine block. It completely suffocates the air intake and instantly kills the massive diesel motor. Complete, terrifying silence suddenly fills the rapidly sinking cabin. The thick black mud aggressively seals the exterior of the cabin door. Richard frantically pushes against the heavy glass, trying to escape. The external hydrostatic pressure of the dense mud is absolutely immense. No human being can push open a door against thousands of pounds of surrounding liquid pressure. The machine sinks completely below the murky surface in under 40 seconds. Deep beneath the surface, the small pocket of breathable air inside the sealed cabin is rapidly depleted. Extreme panic dramatically accelerates his heart rate. His lungs aggressively burn through the remaining oxygen at a terrifying speed. Severe hypoxia sets in rapidly within the freezing, pitch-black steel box. The critical lack of oxygen delivery to the brain causes total loss of consciousness. Irreversible cardiac arrest follows silently in the absolute blackness of the underground bog. Large, thick bubbles of trapped air burst violently at the muddy surface. They send slow ripples across the dark, freezing water. Soon, even the bubbles completely stop rising. Only the very top yellow steel corner of the excavator's main hydraulic arm remains visible above the broken green crust. It points silently up toward the freezing gray sky. The frightened surveyors stand perfectly still on the solid dirt road, staring blankly at the muddy hole in the earth. The ancient liquid ground simply swallowed the heavy machine whole, leaving behind a cold, permanent lesson in the absolute supremacy of geology over human arrogance. August 24, 2011, Nottinghamshire, England. 47-year-old Luke Yeomans is confidently preparing his newly built King Cobra sanctuary for its grand public opening. For decades, he has handled the most venomous creatures on Earth, but today he operates with zero protective gear. The air inside his wooden reptile enclosure is warm and completely still. The only sound is the low hum of water filters and the dry scraping of scales sliding over artificial grass. He is currently rushing to prep the facility for its grand public opening, which is just a few days away. But somewhere along his career, Luke completely lost his respect for the deadly line between human and wild animal. The basic rule for handling a king cobra is to use strict physical barriers. These are the longest venomous snakes in the world. They can literally stand up high enough to look a grown man in the eye. They operate strictly on primitive, defensive survival instincts. Professional colleagues repeatedly warned Luke that he was getting way too relaxed. They begged him to use standard safety hooks and thick bite-proof gloves. Luke stubbornly waved off their warnings. He recently stood in front of local television cameras, handling the deadly reptiles with his bare hands. He confidently told the press, "I will never be bitten because these snakes know me and they respect me." He falsely believed that spending time with them created a real emotional bond. He forgot that a reptile has zero capacity for human empathy. The hidden biological threat here is the highly potent neurotoxic venom stored right behind the snake's eyes. On this quiet Wednesday morning, Luke unlocks the main glass enclosure for a routine cleaning. He is entirely alone and wearing zero protective gear. He casually reaches down toward a massive adult male cobra. He plans to just gently push the animal aside with his bare hands, exactly as he has done 100 times before. But a snake does not have a concept of friendship. It only has immediate sensory inputs and instinctual reactions. Today, for whatever reason, the animal sees the approaching human hand as a direct, mortal threat. This is the exact moment his arrogant illusion of control violently shatters. Time severely slows down in the warm room. The Cobra instinctively flares its wide hood to show its massive size. It lets out a sharp, bone-chilling hiss. Luke pauses for just a second, expecting the animal to calm down and recognize him. It is a fatal miscalculation. The massive snake strikes forward with explosive, blinding speed. The muscle contraction is simply too fast for the human eye to track. The Cobra's open jaws collide violently with Luke's unprotected arm. Two hollow, razor-sharp fangs easily penetrate the epidermis and enter the underlying muscle tissue. The snake's jaw muscles instantly squeeze together. They act exactly like a biological syringe, pumping a massive, concentrated dose of neurotoxic proteins straight into his bloodstream. The Cobra immediately lets go and slithers into a dark corner, leaving behind two small puncture wounds in the epidermal layer. The biological consequences are incredibly fast and entirely clinical. King Cobra venom does not rely on massive cellular degradation or visible tissue damage. Instead, it is a highly specialized chemical weapon designed to instantly shut down the central nervous system. The venom molecules rapidly flood through Luke's circulatory system. They actively bind to the delicate nerve receptors throughout his entire body. They physically block the vital electrical signals trying to travel from his brain to his muscles. Within just a few minutes, profound muscle weakness sets in. The human biological machine rapidly powers down. The most critical failure happens in his diaphragm, the main muscle that forces the lungs to expand. Complete respiratory paralysis takes over. His lungs entirely lose their ability to pull in oxygen from the room. Severe hypoxia rapidly starves his brain. The terrified snake expert collapses onto the damp floor of the enclosure. Total loss of consciousness occurs swiftly. Without a steady supply of oxygen, the heart muscle cannot keep its electrical rhythm going. Irreversible cardiac arrest follows silently within the locked, artificially heated room. The aftermath of the tragedy is profoundly quiet. The warm enclosure remains perfectly still. The massive King Cobra rests in the shadows, entirely indifferent to the catastrophic chemical reaction it just started. It feels no remorse, no guilt, and certainly no respect. Outside the heavy wooden doors, the brightly painted signs advertising the grand opening of the sanctuary blow gently in the English breeze. The arrogant claim of mutual respect has been entirely erased by the cold, unforgiving chemistry of the natural world. May 14, 2016, a major city in the American Southwest. A massive, historic municipal building stands silently above the empty streets, its intricate outside walls built entirely from decorative blocks of natural sandstone. A heavy, relentless thunderstorm has just battered the downtown area for 12 straight hours, soaking every single microscopic grain of the ancient stone. The sharp smell of wet concrete and damp earth fills the empty streets. This specific architectural setup is the chosen playground for 24-year-old Jason Grimes. He is an extreme, highly competitive urban climber. He specializes in a highly dangerous sport called bouldering. This means he scales towering city skyscrapers without any ropes, without any harnesses, and without safety nets. Jason is entirely fueled by pure adrenaline and a massive, blinding ego. The absolute physical rule for this type of extreme, free solo climbing relies on the simple physics of friction. A climber must push their body weight perfectly against solid, dry surfaces to constantly fight gravity. The hidden, fatal danger waiting on this building is the microscopic geology of wet sandstone. Sandstone is not a solid, continuous rock like granite. It is literally millions of tiny, individual grains of sand glued tightly together by water-soluble minerals. Under dry conditions, it is incredibly strong and acts like heavy sandpaper. But when it gets completely soaked with rainwater, the structural strength completely changes. The water acts as a chemical solvent. It severely weakens the microscopic mineral glue. The solid stone temporarily turns back into fragile, packed dirt. A small group of Jason's climbing friends stand nervously on the wet sidewalk. They look up at the dark, soaked stone and urgently plead with him to call off the climb. They explain the basic geology to him, begging him not to trust his life to wet sand. Jason arrogantly laughs at their genuine concern. He aggressively straps his tight rubber climbing shoes on and chalks his bare hands. He looks at his friends with absolute superiority. "My hands do not slip," he proudly declares. "I control every single millimeter of my body, so do not tell me what I can or cannot climb." He turns his back on common sense and starts his vertical climb. He relies entirely on his own physical strength, completely ignoring the compromised environment. This arrogant dismissal of basic science is his ultimate fatal mistake. Jason climbs quickly, his strong fingers finding small, decorative ledges carved into the wet stone facade. He reaches a height of exactly 50 feet above the hard concrete pavement. That is roughly the height of a 5-story building. He reaches his right hand up to grab a thick, protruding sandstone gargoyle. He wraps his fingers tightly around the wet stone. For a brief, agonizing second, the illusion of total control actually holds firm. The rock feels cold and solid beneath his grip. He confidently pulls his entire body weight upward, putting all his kinetic mass onto that single point of contact. This is the exact moment his human arrogance violently collides with objective geology. Time slows down to a terrifying crawl. A sharp, barely noticeable grinding sound echoes just inches from Jason's face. It is the sound of millions of soaked sand grains instantly losing their mineral bond. The structural integrity of the wet sandstone completely fails under the heavy, localized pressure of his pulling fingers. The thick stone ledge violently crumbles into a useless handful of wet, gritty dirt. The mechanical failure is absolute and instantaneous. The vital friction, keeping him stuck to the vertical wall, completely vanishes. The fleeting hope of catching another ledge evaporates as gravity immediately takes full control of his unsupported body. The sudden loss of friction terminates his vertical momentum instantly. Attempts to re-establish friction on the slick stone surface are entirely unsuccessful. The solid world completely abandons him. He begins a terrifying, unhindered freefall toward the ground. The heavy descent takes less than 2 seconds. The underlying mechanics of consequence are incredibly fast, brutal, and entirely clinical. The human biological frame is simply not built to survive the massive kinetic energy generated by a 50-foot drop onto solid concrete. Jason impacts the unyielding sidewalk with tremendous, unimpeded speed. The sudden, violent deceleration causes catastrophic, non-survivable blunt force trauma to his entire skeletal structure. The massive kinetic energy transfer immediately compromises his central nervous system and major internal organs. Total structural failure of the biological machine is instantaneous upon final impact. Rapid loss of consciousness occurs in a fraction of a millisecond. Irreversible cardiac arrest follows immediately. The biological system is permanently shut down by the raw, indifferent physics of a sudden stop. The scene on the quiet city street is chillingly brief and completely devoid of human ego. Distant police sirens begin to wail against the gray morning sky. High above the tragic scene, the historic sandstone building stands completely silent. A small, steady trickle of loose, wet sand gently falls from the broken gargoyle ledge. It rains down softly onto the cold pavement, landing just inches from the quiet body. It is a tiny, fragile pile of wet dirt. It perfectly symbolizes the exact moment a self-proclaimed master of control was brutally reminded that the immutable laws of physics do not care about human confidence. We look for someone to blame, but in each of these 6 stories, the fault lies only with the individual who decided they were above physical law. Would you trade your life for the chance to show off to your colleagues? In the comments, is there any situation for which you would consciously risk death? Like this video if you choose life over ego.